Today's story involves an unsolved murder where the victim himself predicted somebody was trying to kill him. There are a lot of unusual twists and turns, including a very bizarre crime scene. And as ever, I'm going to include some graphic details some people may find disturbing, so discretion is advised. And before we start, if you're interested in stories from the dark side of life, then please remember to like and subscribe so you can be the first to be informed of all this channel's future videos. Okay, let's go. Blair Adams was a Canadian man who was found murdered. The week prior to his death, he began to behave strangely, convinced that people were trying to kill him. This turned out to be prophetic. His body was later discovered in a parking lot. The evidence from the crime scene was unusual and has never been fully explained to this day, and the killer has never been found. Let's take a look at the bizarre events in the week in which Blair was murdered. Blair was 31 years old and lived in Surrey, British Columbia. He worked as a foreman in a construction company, and despite experiencing some personal problems in the past, he was popular amongst his colleagues. Friends and family have described how Blair was always positive and upbeat. But almost overnight, they noticed changes. He began to have wild mood swings and told friends that people were trying to kill him. He wouldn't elaborate on who these people were, but he was adamant that he was in danger. His mother noticed something was wrong with her son. Blair was unable to speak properly, and despite encouraging him to confide in her, he would only say, "I don't want to tell you about it." It's unknown why Blair believed he was in danger, but he never took the opportunity to elaborate. And from here, Blair undertakes a series of strange actions that have never been understood to this day. On July the 5th, 1996, Blair visits his bank and empties his savings account of $6,000 and removes a number of valuables from his safe deposit box. 2 days later, on July the 7th, without informing any of his friends or family, Blair abruptly leaves Surrey and travels 70 miles, or 113 kilometres, to Victoria, British Columbia. There, he tries to board a ferry destined for Seattle in Washington, but is stopped before he is able to do so. Immigration officers are suspicious of Blair and carry out an inspection on him. They notice the hoard of cash and valuables that he's withdrawn from the bank and question him as to where they've come from. They also ask Blair to provide some personal information to them. Blair lies. He tells them that he has no criminal record, but a background check reveals that he does have convictions for drug and assault charges. The combination of the valuables he's carrying and the dishonesty about his background make border officials suspect that Blair may be a drug trafficker, and they deny him permission to cross the border. This is the first but not the last border crossing attempt that Blair will make. That evening, Blair returns home and speaks to a friend. He is anxious and desperate to leave, again repeating that somebody wants him dead. He visits his mum one more time. It's the last time they will ever see each other. The day following this first unsuccessful border crossing, Blair once again tries to enter the USA. He tries to cross on foot at the Pacific Highway border crossing, but is stopped by a patrol officer. The officer notes that Blair has scratches covering his legs and hands, but there's also something else. Blair matches the description of a man who's stolen a vehicle that has since been found abandoned, and confronted with questions about this, Blair denies all knowledge. However, these denials have since been called into question, as a friend later reported that the day before this attempted crossing, she had seen Blair driving a car that didn't belong to him. Due to lack of evidence, Blair is not apprehended, but is still denied permission to cross into the USA. Blair's second attempt to leave Canada has failed, but the next day he will be successful. And this is the final day that anybody reports seeing Blair alive. On July the 10th, Blair rents a car from Vancouver International Airport and finally manages to cross the border, arriving in Seattle. There, he buys a return ticket to Frankfurt, Germany. He has ties with Frankfurt. He once worked there when he was employed in his stepfather's business, and he also dated a woman there for a brief period. For reasons unknown, Blair doesn't even attempt to catch this flight. Instead, he trades his ticket for a flight that takes him to Washington, D.C., and this flight he catches. On his arrival, Blair rents another vehicle from the airport and heads south to Virginia. But he's soon involved in an accident. Travelling along Route 250, Blair backs his car into another vehicle, but thankfully both cars only suffer minor damage. During their interaction, the driver of the other vehicle recalled that Blair seemed nice, but he was in a hurry. With only minor damage to the rental car, Blair continues on his journey and arrives at a gas station in Knoxville, Tennessee at 5:30 that evening. 14 hours later, he would be found dead. An interstate repair service driver is called to the gas station by an employee after he reports a problem with Blair. On arrival, the service driver speaks to Blair, and Blair tells him that the key to his rental vehicle is not working. But the service driver notices something. He can see that the key Blair is trying to use belongs to a completely different vehicle. And seeing as Blair managed to drive there, he knows that the correct key must be somewhere. The service driver asks Blair to check his pockets for another key, but he refuses to do so, insisting that the key he is holding is the correct one. He just refuses to look for another key. Years later, the repair service driver, who was called Gerald Sapp, recalled he didn't think that Blair seemed mentally all there. He just wasn't functioning correctly. And with Blair refusing to look for the correct key, the car ends up being towed to a local garage, whilst Gerald drops Blair off at a nearby hotel. They say their goodbyes, but this is not the last time Gerald appears in the story. He will make another appearance later, and the events from this will result in him quitting his job. Blair is now at the hotel and purchases a room using a $100 bill. He doesn't bother to collect his change. His behaviour grows increasingly erratic. He is seen to enter and re-enter the lobby a total of 5 times in only 40 minutes. Reflecting later on events, a hotel employee stated that he seemed paranoid. He was just nervous, agitated, expecting someone to come in, even though there was nobody there. I don't know who he was looking for, but he was waiting for somebody to walk in on him. Eventually, Blair leaves the hotel, and he's never once entered the room that he's paid for. Now, nobody knows if Blair was right. Was someone waiting for him? Why was he agitated? To this day, we still don't know. At 7:30 a.m. on July the 11th, 2 construction workers arrived to work on site of the Fairfield Inn, Knoxville. There, They spot a man lying in the parking lot, and at first they believe him to be a vagrant, until they notice something odd. Surrounding his half-naked body are a vast number of US, Canadian and German banknotes, later found to be totalling $4,000. And nearby lay a fanny pack which, when opened, was found to contain gold bars, gold and platinum coins and jewellery. And next to the body was a car key. Blair's missing car key. Sometime in the early hours of that morning, Blair Adams had been murdered. The autopsy findings give an insight as to what unfolded that morning. They revealed numerous cuts and abrasions to Blair's body, and there was evidence that he had tried to defend himself during the attack. There was an open wound on his forehead, and this wound bare the resemblance of damage that would be caused by a crowbar. But the blow that killed him was a heavy force to the stomach, perhaps from a heavy kick or being struck by a car. The rupture from this caused an infection, which would eventually claim Blair's life. In one of his hands, he held a single strand of hair, and it's believed that this hair belonged to his killer. But why was Blair killed? Has a concrete motive ever been established? With all of the money and valuables found at the scene, robbery clearly wasn't a motive for Blair's murder. Instead, law enforcement initially followed a theory that Blair's death may have been sex-related, as his body displayed injuries synonymous with such an attack. However, no DNA evidence was found to confirm this. Despite the lack of DNA evidence supporting this theory, some involved in the case still think Blair's death may be sex-related, and we'll look at that in closer detail later. Detectives also speculated that Blair may have been involved in drug dealing, but this was also ruled out. He'd never mentioned dealing drugs to anyone he knew, and no calls to the US, presumably to arrange such a deal, were ever made from his home. With so few leads, witnesses could help to progress the investigation, but only one has come forward. A security guard was working a night shift in a nearby business on the morning in which Blair was murdered. Shortly after 3:30 a.m. that morning, he heard a piercing scream. What was interesting about this scream is that the security guard could swear it sounded like it came from a female. If there was a woman there at the time Blair was murdered, did she scream? And if so, why? We still don't have any answers for this, but after this event, everything fell silent again. Unfortunately, because the security guard didn't actually see anything, there were no new leads for detectives to pursue. But fast forward to 2010, and two women came forward with some new information. They reported seeing Blair talking with a man outside a restaurant in Knoxville, Tennessee, the evening before his death. And despite this composite sketch being released of the man, he has never been identified, so he can't be ruled out of Blair's murder. It's still entirely possible that he could have been involved somehow. And remember Gerald Sapp, the repair service driver? Well, he was questioned by police as a suspect and had a sample of his hair taken, so it could be analysed against the strand found in Blair's hand. It didn't match. And although never accused of the murder, Gerald fell under so much suspicion that the trauma resulted in him quitting his job. With no eyewitnesses to the murder and so little evidence, what line of inquiry are police currently pursuing? Well, Chief of the Knox County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit, David Davenport, believes Blair's death may be related to prostitution. In 1996, there was a truck stop nearby to the crime scene that was a hotbed for such activity. Davenport theorises that it could be a meeting gone wrong. Blair could have been in a car with a prostitute. They had a fight, and he was thrown out of the car into the road and then struck by the car when it was driven away. This theory certainly fits the evidence found at the scene of the murder. It would explain why Blair was found in a state of undress, why he maybe had the hair in his hand from a fight, and the blow to his stomach could have been from the car hitting him whilst he was on the floor. It's now been over 25 years since Blair's death, and the case hasn't progressed much at all during that time. What do you think? Do you think someone was following Blair? Or do you think his death was purely coincidental? And why was he killed? Drugs? Prostitution? Something else? Let us know in the comments below. And that's the story of how one Canadian man who feared for his life was eventually killed under mysterious circumstances. Do you have any thoughts about today's video? If so, please share them in the comments below. And if you enjoyed today's story, please remember to like and subscribe to this channel so that you can be the first to be informed of any of our future videos. Until then.